Good afternoon. I'm Jerry White. I had the privilege for almost 19 years of leading the navigators. Now, when you lead the navigators, that's like herding cats. But the fact is, one of the great blessings of that time was to have as a friend and a counselor throughout that entire time, Commander Jim Downing. And Jim has been an enlisted man in the Navy, got a commission, had command of a ship, and he brings all of that experience to bear as he was one of the earliest members of the navigators in the 1930s. Today he's going to share with us a bit on Pearl Harbor, and having been at Pearl Harbor celebrations myself, sitting over in Honolulu and meeting a number of the other Pearl Harbor survivors, it's always an interesting thing to listen to their story. Many of them just say, well, I was just there. Jim Downing was more than being just there. He had a tremendous part in World War II, but in the military aspects, but far beyond that, throughout his life in being a leader in the navigators. In Hebrews, it says, remember those who led you and who spoke the word of God to you, and considering the outcome of their way of life, imitate their faith. Now, Jim's had a lot of outcome. At 96 years, we can watch it from up close and at a distance. So, Jim, welcome, and we look forward very much to hearing what you have to share as to what God has done in your life, and particularly related to Pearl Harbor. Jim, go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, General White.
He remembers the rank. When you're old military guys, we do that. Thank you.
It will soon be 68 years since the attack on Pearl Harbor. So several generations have come and gone. And I find as I go around that many people think the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor December 7th, 1941. We responded, fought a war, which we won, and that was it. But there's a lot more to it than that. The seeds were planted some 2,500 years ago when the Japanese were worshiping the sun goddess. I've never had anybody pronounce this for me, but phonetically it looks like it's Amaterasu, ancestor of the ruling family. Back this far ago, she envisioned a future island empire in which the entire world would be subject to her descendants. An expert on this area is Mr. H.P. Wilmot. This is a quotation from one of his books. Japanese mythology tells us of the sun goddess Amaterasu and of an island empire ruled by her descendants and populated by her chosen people. The people that day felt a religious fervor to evangelize the world and bring everybody under the domination of what they thought was the one true God, the sun goddess. Later on, I think a political ambition got mixed in with the spiritual, and so the Japanese started progressing. Actually, this is a very famous painting of Amaterasu, and being a sun goddess, she turned the light on and off. This particular picture commemorates a time that she got angry with her brother, so she shut off the light for a few days. And this is the painting of when she restored light to the world. Up until the late 1800s, Japan was a pretty small nation, about the size of California. But by 1942, less than 50 years later, you can see Japan controlled, had extended her own islands, taken over Manchuria, which they renamed Manchukuo, Korea, a fourth of China, the British and Dutch possessions up and down the coast, Malaya, out into the sea and the Philippines, including all these islands that are envisioned there. That was no small accomplishment, to go from a small island nation to this large an empire. So I want to trace kind of step by step what happened. Successful war with China, obtained Taiwan, the peace terms. In 1904 and 5, had a successful war with Russia and attacked the Russian fleet. This is a picture of it that Brad Ray found for me. So you can see the ships that were destroyed in this war. This put them in a position to proceed. So in 1910, as you can see, they annexed Korea. Then the Germans were losing a war in Europe. They had great possessions out in the Pacific and China. So Japan took over those possessions. 1927 was a very memorable time. The Prime Minister was named Tanaka. The Emperor at that time was Hirohito. Of course, he was not a human being. He was a god, a descendant of Amaterasu. After World War II, he denounced his deity and let the world know that he was a human being. But for 2,500 years, his ancestors were considered God. His prime minister was Tanaka. And in 1927, he submitted a proposal to the emperor, and the emperor approved it. It was a 100-year plan to conquer the world. Phase one was to exploit Manchurian manpower and resources, which they did, took that over. Phase two, and the real purpose of World War II, was to secure the southern resources area, which was Indonesia, Malaysia, and so forth, because they had to have rubber, tin, and oil, having none of their own. Phase three, which was not dated, was to build a military machine capable of conquering the entire world. That was their ambition. Now you can see by this map that they had a little problem at this point. You can see that in the red, their empire, but Britain owned the part shaded in yellow. France had Indochina. The Dutch, the East Indies, a large part of that part, and the United States, the Philippines. Well, with Britain, France, and the Dutch engaged in Europe in the war with Hitler, it was a very timely point in history for them to attack. They were all weak, couldn't defend their territory. So it'll loom up as we go along that their main objective in attacking Pearl Harbor was to secure the Philippines, because you can see they could not loot the rubber, tin, and oil from this part as long as we had a military base right there in the main shipping lane. So this is what influenced their attack at the time they did attack. So after the memorial was approved by the emperor, they proceeded to annex Manchuria. They seized Hainan Island, which was in the news a few years back when one of our reconnaissance planes made a forced landing there. 1940, set up a Japanese government in China, controlled about a fourth of China, and then in this same period signed the Pact of Steel with Germany. So here's a picture of the Japanese Prime Minister and Hitler shaking hands, and another picture of them. They looked happy as they went away. There was in the dream plan, probably never finalized, but at least a thought that Germany would invade the United States through Canada and Japan through Mexico. So they were hooking up for that purpose. In conquering China from 35 to 38, there was a brutality that's never been matched in history. In the Holocaust in Germany, some 6 million Jews were killed. The Japanese killed 15 million civilians and soldiers in their conquest of China. The most publicized of this conquest is the horror of Nanking. And you can see here pictures on the left of the soldiers using humans for bayonet practice. And over on the right, they were burying Japanese in mass graves, Chinese in mass graves. According to, people don't agree, but they say at least somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000 women were raped, and another 200,000 more. Nanking was a city of 1 million, so they slaughtered almost a fourth of the citizens of Nanking. Also in 1937, during that time, the Japanese wanted to test our will to see what we would do to our government opposed the Japan expansion, but the Japanese didn't think there was too much teeth on it. So they sunk one of our gunboats in the Yangtze River in China. There were a lot of headlines. There was the Los Angeles Times, but no retaliatory action was taken of any kind. So the Japanese concluded that we were all talk, no action. They were free to go ahead because we didn't do anything about it. The League of Nations, of which Japan was a member, were strongly opposed to their expansionist ambitions and brought such pressure on them that they resigned from the League of Nations. Then, with France occupied in Europe, they occupied all of Indochina and completed the training of a landing force to land in the Philippines, consisting of 200,000 man army, 800 aircraft, 94 troop transports. So the Philippines was their next major target. Well, what did the U.S. do? In 1939, canceled a treaty with Japan that had been in effect for since 1911, 2 years before I was born. And the majority of their manufacturing was dependent on our scrap iron. The main fleet, Pacific Fleet, moved to Pearl Harbor. We'll talk more about it in a minute. But the action that President Roosevelt did on July 1941 persuaded the British and the Dutch, as well as us, to cut off oil exports. Japan depended on these three countries for 90% of their oil. They only had a 15-month supply. So once we'd cut off their imports of oil, why, things began to heat up. This is a picture of Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy. On his right is Admiral Harold Stark, who was the Chief of Naval Operations. On this side is Admiral Yarnell, and on this side, Admiral Richardson. Admiral Richardson was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Yarnell of the Asiatic Fleet. I don't know what they talked about, but I know what the outcome was. Admiral Richardson got replaced by Admiral Kimmel. I'll tell you more about that in just a couple more slides. But in 1939, there was kind of a mini World's Fair on Treasure Island. And presidents didn't have a lot to do in those days, it appears. So he came out and cut the ribbon, starting to open the fair. And then instead of going back to Washington, he got aboard the cruiser Houston to go to Panama on a fishing trip. So that's the ship that he took. The admiral on this ship was Admiral Kimmel, who was a two-star admiral. Now, as I mentioned, the fleet moved. The third ship in line is the USS West Virginia, which was my ship for 10 years. It was on. Pacific, compare the two strengths of the two navies. In the Pacific, we had an Atlantic fleet, but you can see where they outnumber us in battleships, way outnumbered us in aircraft carriers, cruisers outnumbered, light cruisers, destroyers, submarines. They had a superior fleet in every way. Besides having an army that was almost 10 times the size of our armed forces, scattered out in various places. Now, they had a pretty good spy system. This is a postage stamp one of our missionaries gave me. And I don't know when they first started using this, but can you see Battleship Row on there? As you enlarge it, it kind of loses its distinctness. But I don't know where my friend got hold of this. He said it was pretty old because the writing is from left to right instead of right to left. But they had a pretty good spy system of ships that they could publish a postage stamp that showed our ships at anchor. Maureen and I were married about this same time in July of 41. Now, why there were so many ships in Pearl Harbor on December 7th? The most that had ever been in that port, to my knowledge. Well, to see things heated up between the U.S. and Japan repeated what they've done throughout history and said, we don't want a war, and we're going to send a special peace ambassador so that we can iron out our differences and won't have to go to war. The official peace ambassador was retired Admiral Kurutsu. Now, as I've searched the history books and the papers on this, none of them had him in Pearl Harbor the day before the attack. But this, my memory is very, very poor. I'm right and they're wrong, because I remember his seaplane landing Friday before December 6th and landed right in the middle of the fleet. Well, the word from Washington was, we want him to see that we don't have any warlike intentions. So bring in all the fleet here, so he'll see that we're peacefully tied up at an anchor. Actually, from the time the fleet moved to Pearl Harbor in 1940 until December 41, we kept 1/3 of the fleet out on patrol. I was a part of the patrol that came out just before the Pearl Harbor attack. And it was so congested, so many people, I had to stand in line for 2 hours to catch a bus. The buses had to shuttle back and forth from Pearl Harbor to Honolulu. There's no way that the base or the city could absorb that many people with 1/3 more than they were used to being there. I don't know what they're laughing about, but the one on the left is Admiral Kurutsu, and this is Admiral Nomura, who was the U.S. ambassador. They were the people handling the peace negotiations. Sunrise, December 7th, 1941, and there's a question of whether or not Kurutsu, when he took off Saturday morning for Washington, knew that the Japanese fleet was just over the horizon. I'm of the impression that he didn't know, and Admiral Nomura both knew. But they were supposed to be peace ambassadors to get us off the alert. So you can see there the force that was out there: 6 carriers, 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, 8 tankers and supply ship. In port that morning were 164 Navy ships, Navy Coast Guard, and small craft. The harbor was jammed. Now here's an aerial picture of Pearl Harbor. You can see that comes in from the sea, very narrow passage here. Come on in, this is Ford Island over here, and the water along here has been dredged out where it's deep enough to handle a battleship or a carrier, but all the rest of the water here is shallow water that can only take smaller ships. It can't accommodate a carrier battleship. So there's a very small pocket in there where that the battleships and carriers could anchor or tie up. Now another picture of the harbor shows that you have to come through a blown out channel in the coral, then on into the harbor. What admiral would want to see his fleet in there? Admiral Richardson, who was commander-in-chief, put on civilian clothes. This actually appeared in the newspaper at the time, and went back to see the president. And he said that keeping the fleet in Pearl Harbor, or in Hawaii, was not a warning to Japan. The Japanese knew that to get ready for war, we had to go back to the West Coast shipyards to weld up the portholes, take up the teakwood decks, take on the war supply of ammunition. So he said, we're just giving the Japanese extra time because we cannot go to war directly from Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt's response was to fire him. And he got his fishing buddy, Admiral Kimmel, the two-star admiral. They bypassed all the senior three-star admirals and four-star admirals and made Admiral Kimmel the commander-in-chief. Now, I don't want to question his professional competence, and perhaps Roosevelt saw in him the kind of a person he wanted. But he was not the most popular among the other officers in the fleet, having jumped over all the senior officers to become the commander-in-chief. So he held a meeting just shortly before Pearl Harbor, and what they concluded was it was impossible for Japan to launch a carrier-based attack on Hawaii. So when he was given the word December 7th, he said, I don't believe it. Or it had been decided that couldn't happen. Across that narrow point on the harbor there, we did have a torpedo net, well, a submarine net. So the submarines couldn't sneak it at night. But with that many ships in port, a pretty big logistic problem. One was just getting rid of the garbage. So every morning at daylight, a big barge and tug went around all the ships and gathered their garbage, took it out to sea and dumped it. So they opened the torpedo net to let the garbage lighter out. Now, I believe there were a couple other ships that were scheduled to go that morning. Japanese had their midget submarines. They knew the schedule waiting outside, so as soon as the net was opened, they came on in. The submarine didn't do a lot of damage, but their main mission was to make sure that the ships were still in a position that the Japanese thought they were in. The radar was turned off at 7:30. I think that we probably copied some of our strategies from the Indians that would never attack during dark hours. So we put pretty safe between sunset and sunrise. We're going to have a war, wait till daylight to start. So the radar that the Army had, there were a couple of sergeants up there, Sergeant Lockhart and another, that when 7:30 came, it was kind of like the precursor, I guess, to video games. They're having a lot of fun up there on the radar. And they picked up this flight of aircraft. And Bradbury was able to get the chart on it. So they tracked the Japanese planes coming in, and then they called their officer they reported these planes coming in from the northeast, and northwest rather. And the officer said, well, we've got some B-17s coming from the States. It must be them. Well, the problem was the B-17s were coming in from the opposite direction. So they turned off the radar. Then you can see where they ceased tracking right here on that. We kept a destroyer on patrol also, just as an extra safety measure. And it just went back and forth. The destroyer Ward one of the men here in town was serving on at that time, a friend of mine. We called those destroyers the Four Pipers. But he picked up a submarine and sunk it. And the National Geographic Society found it 3 or 4 years ago. And there was a picture of it lying on the bottom. You can see it had 2 torpedo tubes in it. If you've watched the movies on Pearl Harbor, you remember that they've got that incident in there where the captain of the ward reported to his superior officer that he had sunk a submarine in the channel. And the word came back, confirm. So in the film Tora, 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 they really dramatized this. And this salty old chief petty officer looked out and saw what was going on. And he said, confirm, confirm, confirm. So he didn't think they were quite as alert as they should have been. So the Japanese came in with 183 airplanes in the first wave. 49 high-level bombers, 40 torpedoes, 51 dive bombers, and 43 fighters, first wave. An hour later, the second wave took off from the carriers to finish off what had been begun. 160 planes in this, 54 high-level, 78 dive bombers, 35 fighters in the second wave. So in the left here, you can see where the first wave came in, and the second wave rendezvoused over here. Now, the Japanese had 2 main objectives. The main objective was to destroy the battleships because their intelligence led them to believe that our plan for defending the Philippines involved stationing the battleships in certain strategic places in the Philippines. So that was their main target. But they knew we had about 400 aircraft on the island, and they didn't want a single airplane to follow back to their ships. So probably a third, or maybe a half, of their attacks were at the 6 airfields on Oahu. And we'll get a closer look in a little bit at them. Now, this is a Japanese photograph showing the splashes from some of the bombs. You can see Battleship Row right at the bottom of the splash right here. And you can see 2 airplanes. You can look closely up there, Japanese planes flying. Every Japanese aviator had to give an account of his torpedo. So the Japanese put this back together, that you will see that 9 were aimed at the battleship West Virginia, which was my ship right here. Another 9 were aimed at the Oklahoma, which was right here. They got a lucky hit on the California with just 1 torpedo. Some of them went in the mud. Some of them went underneath the ships, were set too deep. But you count for all 42 torpedoes in that the planes that they had. The bombers weren't quite so good. Now, we can't distinguish which raid this was, but 50 bombs were dropped by this flight. 48 of them missed their targets. And this was probably due to the fact that the Arizona was on fire and burning, and the smoke obscured them, so they couldn't see the targets. So take a look at how short. You see, every one of these were short either on this side or this side. Had they been successful, there'd have been a bunch of scrap iron out there where Battleship Row had been. But many of the ships, most of them, were salvaged. You can see on the California here, all of them were short on the side there. But they did sink the California, but most of the bombs missed. Now, around the island, you can see here that 6 major bases, over 100 fighters in Wheeler Field. They struck all these air bases, and I won't go into detail what they accomplished there, but they were very sure, so no U.S. aircraft pursued them back. So of the 394 military aircraft we had, They destroyed 164, damaged 159 others, so we only had 71 out of nearly 400 left when their attack was over. This is a picture from the land side of what the battleship row looked like. This is what Ford Island looked like, where they destroyed every aircraft on Ford Island. And that's another close-up of how intense the smoke was. They didn't have radar-guided bombs in those days, or anyway, no smart bombs, so they just guessed and fortunately missed most of their guesses. This picture I wanted in here because each battleship carries approximately 1 million gallons of crude oil, and oil is lighter than water. So the part you don't see in pictures about Pearl Harbor is the fuel oil. When I got aboard the West Virginia, I'll talk about in a minute, the fuel oil was 6 inches deep and impossible to stand up. Probably won't go sliding. So pretty soon we all looked like we'd had a bath in oil. But the fire coming out of the Arizona was so intense that the oil on the water caught fire. And the battleship Tennessee turned on her propellers just to keep the fire away from. But this was the saddest sight of the whole time, was to see these sailors blown overboard in the oil come up and then their body burned like a torch. Later on, the Navy taught people never to come to surface without making a place to come up. But they were just human torches. Now we had boats out there trying to pick them up, and they caught on fire, some just for the oil that was on there. That's a Japanese picture, and you can see the oil here. It took the shipyard 2 years to skim up all the oil off the harbor that spilled out during the attack. Well, among the casualties was my home for 10 years, the battleship West Virginia in better days. There we are sailing under the Brooklyn Bridge in one of our trips to New York. But that's what it looked like after the hit with those 9 torpedoes. We did catch 2 2,000-pound bombs, but they were both duds and didn't explode. Pearl Harbor is kind of a shallow harbor. So where we were moored was only 40 feet of water. Loaded, a battleship draws 36 feet of water. So there's only 4 feet of water underneath. So the bottom kept us from sinking all the way. But she did keep settling down in the mud. And of course, everything above the waterline was on fire when this picture was taken. That's another picture of the West Virginia and Tennessee, and still another. So you can see how intense the fire was from the paint on the ship and then the fuel oil, generated most of it. About 20 yards behind us was the battleship Arizona. Now, the Arizona has a tripod mast held up by 3. And for the next 3 days, the fire was so intense as the steel weakened, well, you could see it just bowing over and over again. It started out straight up and just almost see it come down there. The destroyer Shaw was in dry dock, and they got a direct hit, and that's a picture of the Shaw blowing up in dry dock. If you were a little further to the left, you could see the propellers of the Oklahoma sticking up above the water. They're supposed to be on the underwater, not above. But the Oklahoma was hit by the same number of torpedoes we were hit. And she capsized in about 8 minutes after the first torpedoes hit. However, there was a bright side to it that, of course, when they capsized, all the power lights went off. But the sailors were pretty sharp. They figured out there's something wrong when you're walking on the ceiling. So the deck's over your head. So they figured out they were probably upside down. So they worked their way down to what should have been the bottom, got hold of some pipe or hammer and began to pound, and made enough sound that Navy Yard sent people out with cutting torches, and they cut a hole in the bottom and rescued about 300 through the hole in the bottom there just before the attack was even over, or about the time it was over. The number of U.S. ships that were damaged was 20 out of 164. What did the others do? Their crews shot down 29 Japanese aircraft. And you can see by this picture, the blossoms up there as our anti-aircraft guns got into action, which minimized the effect of the second waves that came in. We had about 30 destroyers in port. 3 were damaged. 27 of them were undamaged. We were moored next to the battleship Tennessee, which was practically undamaged. She fired every round of anti-aircraft ammunition she had on board during the attack. But a very sad sight was the battleship Pennsylvania, which was in dry dock with 2 destroyers, the Castle and Downs, in dry dock with her. Well, the bomb, of course, blew her oil tanks open and lost one of the destroyers. And I was on the scene just as that happened, so probably that was the reason it was such a sad sight to me. Now I've got this picture up here for a reason, and if you'll notice over here by the submarine base, there's a fuel farm. There's another fuel farm over here. It would have taken us 6 months to replace the fuel. The Japanese never touched it. There's the Navy Yard that repaired ships coming in from the Coral Sea. Didn't touch it. Submarines carried the war for the first 2 years. Didn't touch it. These ordinarily would be very strategic targets, but they weren't after occupying Hawaii. They were intent on occupying the Philippines and wanted to get rid of everything that might deter them from doing that. Now, what isn't real well known is what else happened during that 24 hours. 6 other attacks. This is all Hawaiian time. 2 hours later, Shanghai and Malaya. 11:30, Singapore, and at 1 o'clock, Guam and Wake. 2 p.m., Hong Kong. 3 o'clock, which was 9 hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, they attacked the Philippines. So you can see they had an ambitious day. Now in the Philippines, the arrows point to the places that we had bases throughout the Philippines. The Japanese used 360 planes on the Pearl Harbor attack. They used 500 planes to attack the Philippines. The U.S. had 142 aircraft available. All but 39 were destroyed. 18 B-17s, 85 fighters, and 30 miscellaneous on the ground. I read occasionally where MacArthur's judgment is questioned because he had orders in case of Japanese aggression to bomb their bases in Taiwan. And his the commander of his Air Force wanted to do this, but he wouldn't allow him. So a few other planes were in the air, but most of them were destroyed on the ground in the Philippines. And I looked a little bit more like this back in those days than I do today. I have a postcard I just found the other day that my wife wrote to my mother. See, the date is December 10th, 1941. She wrote this 3 days after the attack. You people your age have heard of the penny postcard, but you could send a 1 cent postcard from Honolulu to Missouri for 1 cent in those days. However, if you want to speed it up, you could put an airmail stamp and a Pan American clipper would take it for 20 cents. So she put a 20-cent stamp on this. And the postmaster red marked Clipper mail, so it made sure it got on the plane. And they'd already started censoring the mail by this time, so it had to go through censorship. But it did get to my mother. Now maybe you can read some of that, but in this middle paragraph here, she said, everything happened so swift that everyone was simply dazed. It seemed almost like a nightmare from which we could not awake. And then she assured my mother that I was okay. She'd spent a couple hours with me the day before. Okay, I'm kind of giving the background. Now I want to talk about how I was personally involved in it. And if there are questions, let's keep them all at the end, and we'll end up here with questions. The next picture is a drawing of the layout. That morning, Saturday night, we had a big meeting in the Navigator home in Honolulu. Harold DeGroff and his wife Belva, who were running the home, were about to have a third child. And so they took the weekend off. So Marina and I were in the home over the weekend. One of the highlights of the Saturday night meeting was a young sailor named Roy Robertson showed up. And we had about 125 in the meeting. And Roy told me later, I didn't realize did this, but I asked for memory verses. Well, Roy only knew one verse, which was John 3:16. So he got in real early in the game because he was afraid somebody would quote his verse and he wouldn't have one. But one thing he did when he went back that Saturday night was to resolve he was going to memorize more scripture than the John 3:16. Now, the Navy was so hard up for aviators that shortly after that, any Navy person who was a college graduate could apply for flight school. So Roy was a college graduate, so he was accepted for flight school and became a carrier-based aviator in the war. But, back to Sunday. We had 8 guys stayed overnight. Marina was fixing breakfast. And at 7:45, we began to hear these explosions. Now, my thought was the Army tested gun emplacements every Sunday morning, so it wasn't anything new to hear explosions. But it was rumored that the German battleship Grass Bay was in the area. It was also rumored that 3 British cruisers were there trying to find her and sink her. So I thought, when I heard these explosions, the British had picked up she's pulled into port, because under international law, a ship could pull into port, a neutral port, for 24 hours and couldn't be attacked in the port. But it had to either surrender for the duration of the war or go back and fight within 24 hours, which the Germans had done frequently. So I thought that's what the explosion was. About that time, a shell landed in the backyard and dug a crater about 25 feet across. One of our fellows had a Bible study at 8 o'clock. So he'd headed for the battle that stayed all night. He had headed for his ship, and he saw the smoke. He turned around, and at that time we turned on the radio. And the MC, Wilbur Edwards, who owned the station, when they had 2 radio stations, he said, I phoned Army and Navy Intelligence, and they've advised us that the island of Oahu is under enemy attack. But he said the enemy has not been identified. Stay tuned. We'll give more information. So we jumped in Herb's car and started down. So we missed the first 20 minutes of the action. Now, I wouldn't be here today if I'd been there, because the torpedoes made a 140-foot hole right where I would have been in there. But the devastation took place in 90% of it in 11 minutes. So by missing the first 20 minutes, we missed the main devastation. Well, quite a shock as we just a few minutes away drove down. About a year earlier, the Italian fleet had been caught in port at Scapa Flow, and a lot of their ships sunk. The pictures in all the newspapers. As I looked out the harbor, I couldn't believe that the same thing had happened to us that happened to Russia and in the War of 1905 and to the Italians in Scapa Flow. But here, my ship was on fire and sinking. Well, no boats were running. So, Ken Waters that I was with and I walked from where the boat would be right down here and caught the ferry over to Fort Island. So we had to walk right past the Pennsylvania dry dock on the way. So we got a ferry which was running continuous here, went down, and the West Virginia was on the bottom. Tennessee was next to land. So we got over on the Tennessee, and I slid down a gun barrel and got aboard the West Virginia. And everything was on fire. I knew where the ammunition was, so I got a fire hose from the Tennessee and tried to cool the ammunition so it wouldn't blow up. As we got to the edge there, Ken Waters and I, we always carried a Bible notebook and some more stuff. And Ken, remember, said to me, "Looks like we're going to need both hands." So we put our Bible notebook in a fire extinguisher, that locker there on the pier, so we could get both hands. Well, when you're in a situation like that, no matter what you're trying to do, if there's bodies around, you can't ignore that. So there were still many bodies. We'd lost 105 people that morning. The Navy had equipped us with name tags with a fireproof cord on them. So it's easy to identify a person. So while I had the fire hose in one hand, I went around, turned over name tags. I'm the only person who can ever tell their parents what happened to their son. So I memorized as many of these as I could, and later wrote letters, told them what had happened, and held the fire hose in the other hand. But what was going on in my mind here in the tanker right here, the Neil show right here, Ordinary carries 6 million gallons of aviation gasoline. Now, she had offloaded some of it the night before, but the captain was afraid that the Japanese would sink him right where he was, and that would block the Maryland, Tennessee from getting out. So he decided to move in case they were sunk. He just barely missed the California, headed over to subbase. So I watched him move in here, about 50 yards from the Newell show. I know what a quart of gasoline will do. What do you think a few million gallons will do? Now, the Japanese fighters didn't meet much resistance. They all had machine guns and light bombs. So there's 78 of them originally. We shot down a few of them. But they saw how strategic this tanker was. And they were like a swarm of bees, all running. And I said, well, one of them's going to hit pretty soon. And when it does, it'll do more damage than everything has done up to this point. So for almost 2 hours, I lived thinking that I'm going to be in God's presence next minute. What could I do? Oblivious to everything else except watching this tanker go up. Well, if you've never penetrated, even though they must have fired hundreds of bullets into her, didn't penetrate the tanks. She didn't blow up. Got on over to the submarine base. But after doing what I was doing on the ship for a while, I got real hungry and tired, kind of fatigued, you know. And so one of my friends was on the Tennessee tied up to us, and we were communicating over the lifeline occasionally. And I was so fatigued that I just said, "Gus, you think you could take me up to the galley and get me a sandwich and something to drink, maybe?" And he said, "Yeah, I know the people up there. I can take you out." So I went in my oil-soaked uniform, tracking oil on their nice clean decks there. And when I got up the galley, I looked at the clock, and it was 11:45. Now, if you had asked me what time it was, I would have said it can't be more than 9:30. I've never had an experience before or after the thing so compressed that nearly 3 hours was packed into less than 30 minutes. I couldn't believe it. I thought the clock was wrong. It can't be 11:45. But it was. So just a lot was happening during that time. So much happening, couldn't keep track of it. Now, I just want to add a little about this. You are aware that Lieutenant Commander Fushida, later Captain Fushida, led the raid. He had extra gas tanks on his plane, no armament, and he flew around directing the raid from the beginning to end. After the war, he was writing a book called No More Pearl Harbor. John MacArthur sent for him to come in for a consultation one day. An American missionary gave him a tract. And Fushida was having a problem with this book because he said, "How do you restrain the primitive instincts in man that causes things like that?" Well, this tract he gave him was a story of an airman on General Doolittle's bombers named Joseph de Chaser. And he was a prisoner of war with Japan, got a Bible while he was a prisoner, became a Christian, went back to Japan as a missionary. So Fushida read the tract. He said, "Why would this man that we mistreated so badly want to come back and serve us?" He said, "Well, he got out of the Bible. I want a Bible." So Glenn Wagner, the missionary that had given him the tract, got him a Bible, and he became a Christian. A ex-police captain in Chicago recruited him to work with his youth organization, and he traveled back between Japan and the U.S. And this may be the shocker to some of you right here, that he was a guest at Glen Erie and stayed at least 3 occasions that I remember in room 303. So I had good conversations with him. Now, I'm not sure whether he told me or whether I read this what he had said, but the question I think probably I asked him, I said, we were afraid of a return attack. Did you plan a return attack? And he said, no. He said, we had a 4-hour window to refuel. And if we stayed more than 4 hours, we'd miss our tankers on the way to Japan. But he said, my mission was to destroy the battleships. Once I had the pictures, mission accomplished on his way home. The last 3 airplanes that I saw that morning were the 3 reconnaissance planes flying real low. And they got pictures, of course. And so he was ready to go back to Japan. Here's what we did. That's what we're supposed to do. And we did it. So he's written several books, and you can go online and find a lot of information on him. He had a strong testimony. Fushida. Well, I just want to say one more thing, and then we'll open up to questions if you have any. But what was my outstanding experience? I belonged to a British organization called the Enlisted Men's Christian Union for a long time. I used to get the publication. A British soldier in this publication was in the evacuation at Dunkirk. Now, you probably remember that between World War I and II, the French built the Maginot Line on the German-French border so that it had enough ammunition for 3 years so that Germany could never invade France. But Hitler went around through Belgium right around the end, and the guns were pointed the wrong way. The British were going to assist the French. They had an expeditionary force of 350,000 in their army, and they ran into the Germans. So they were no match for them, so they went back to Dunkirk. And for 3 days, while the British were evacuating them back to England, the Germans bombed and strafed them. This British soldier was one of them. And he said, you can't dodge them. Might as well have some fun. So he organized a soccer tournament. And between strafing and bombing, they were playing soccer out there, about 6 teams. But he said, I had the deepest peace that I've ever had in my life. I think what he was describing was, Lord, I'm going to be with you in a minute. Another minute. Well, I experienced that same peace. And for that more than 2 hours, what I expected to be in the Lord's presence the next minute, great occasion, just that peace. Well, the application of the lesson I learned was that if there's danger, the presence of God is very real. If there's not danger, he doesn't bother. So if I ever get upset, get uptight about something, this is all my imagination. If this were real, I would feel his presence. That may be one of the reasons that I have the blood pressure of a teenager, nearly 96 years old. I don't worry. Don't get upset much. If there's danger, his presence is very real. If there's no danger, he'd let your imagination run wild in what you think. Well, these are some of my memories from that day. Anybody have a question? If you do, Peter, maybe you'd help me here with this.
Two questions. One, mention about the telegraph that never arrived in Washington that was discussed, that they intercepted the code that said that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked at the exact time it was attacked, and it was never delivered or never sent back out to Pearl Harbor. Any comment about that? Then the second thing is you made you asked about an additional wave. In the movie Tora, 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 Yamamoto made the decision that they would not attack. They had the capabilities, but he decided that they'd done enough damage. So those are my two questions.
Yes, well, what happened, we had picked up enough intelligence to know the Japanese were going to attack, but everybody concluded it would be the Philippines. So we had had our torpedoes armed for 9 months in readiness that the Navy had. I think the Air Force wasn't maybe that alert, but expecting to come. Nobody believed. Of course, there was no satellites, no radar, and you had no idea where they were. The Japanese were coming, although our attaché should have alerted our people that the fleet was not in port. They did not do. So believing that the attack was going to come in the Philippines, on the morning of December 7th, the Japanese delivered a 14-part coded message declaring war. And the purpose of the declaration was that they would no longer allow the U.S. and Britain to interfere with their expansion in Asia. That was the purpose of the war. But as this code began to come in, General Marshall, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sent a message to General Short and Admiral Kimmel. But in those days, radio didn't work in bad weather. So the transmitter in Washington could not relay the message. So he sent it RCA, and it went commercial. And when the messenger picked it up to take to them, the attack had already begun. So they had no warning from him that it might not be the Philippines, it might be there. So that's what happened. Now, I was just reviewing my file on this the other day, and there were probably 50 messages that were later analyzed by intelligence. Any one of them would have been a warning that the Japanese might attack Pearl Harbor. Talk of them came from other foreign ambassadors who had the word. But they did not interpret that other than the Japanese will probably attack the Philippines. That was their conclusion, and that's the only defense that we prepared for. As I mentioned, our fleet came in. The Army brought their patrols in. Radar was turned off. The submarine net was open. Everything's fine in Hawaii.
Jim, on the casualties during those attacks, how many total died? How many died from your ship? And how many in the NAV Fellowship died during that attack?
Yes. Altogether, there were approximately 3,000, most of them Navy men that were killed that morning. And most of them were the Arizona. Over 1,100 on the Arizona. On the West Virginia, we lost 105 during the attack. And then later, when the ship was brought up, discovered 2 more bodies in the ship, 2 guys who were trapped. And they'd kept a calendar and marked off every day on there. But eventually, they ran out of oxygen. So that was 2 more added to the 105. Now, being a postmaster among my other duties, I got copies of all the death certificates. So I went over the copies of the death certificates and tried to recall each person I knew, many of them. We had about 1,500 on the ship. And I tried to think if I'd ever talked to them. Well, I'd talked to about 30 of them. And I tried to remember the response. And most of them said, well, I believe. I want to become a Christian, but at a more convenient time. But of our own fellowship, there were about 18 of the 105 that were part of our fellowship. Now, some of them weren't real mature Christians, but my observation was, I looked at it, well, maybe there's young Christians in heaven that need follow up too. So it took a few of our gang to do some follow up there.
Jim, when I was in on the aircraft carrier in the Tonkin Gulf during the Vietnam War, and some of our airplanes would come back on fire and crash next to the ship, we discovered more guys would go to chapel. It became a place for us navigator guys to spot the new ones and see if we could share the gospel with them and so forth. What you experienced was so much larger that I'd like a little bit of what happened, spiritually, what you discovered after that attack.
Well, the only preparation Hawaii had for war was they did have underground air raid shelters that had electricity in them, but no blackout above ground. So the night of the attack, the evening of the attack, the Honolulu police did not have radio. So they took over the 2 broadcast stations to broadcast to their police cars by radio. So all the civilian population were blacked out, and so all they did was listen to police radio that night. My wife was one of them that stayed up listening to that. But a couple of days after the attack, I started a Bible study. There were about 4,000 displaced people from the ships that were sunk or damaged there at the base. And we met in the basement of the building. It wasn't lighted. It got so big that we moved to Ford Island. So for 3 months, every night we had an evangelistic study. And as far as the response was concerned, I got letters back from dozens and maybe hundreds of them that had become Christians, and we're glad they did. So we had a very responsive thing going for the next 60 or 70 days after in the air raid shelters there.
Jim, you've kept a hand on our present military. What is your take on this thing today and our reaction of our troops today, that their regard towards God and the ministry of the navigators?
John the Baptist was asked by the soldiers, now if they become Christians, what do I do? You remember what he told them? He says, stop complaining. about your pay. Now, we used to have a saying in our gang, probably wasn't original, don't say, where he leads me, I will follow, until you can say, what he feeds me, I will swallow. So, John the Baptist, you find this in Luke chapter 3, he knew that a military guy stopped griping. Why, it'd be so unusual that everybody would notice that and say, what happened to him? So that was his advice. Quit complaining.
Hi, Jim. Just had one question. At 7:39, the radar was turned off. Could you explain why that? I think you alluded to it a little bit, but could you explain that a little more? Why?
Yes, well, Sergeant Lockhart and his companion went off duty at sunrise, and they just stayed there. But my understanding is that when they reported this flight of planes, and the officer said, well, we've got some planes coming in from the States, that they just, okay, that's it. And those B-17s were landing right during the attack. Most of them were destroyed landing there that morning. And over on Ford Island, a carrier Enterprise was offshore. And they were coming back in port the next day, and they sent their planes in to land ahead of time. And they didn't know the recognition signal. So when they started to land at Ford Island, the tower had asked them for the recognition signal. They didn't know it, so they shot them down, our own planes, that night. Well, I have to tell you one story in case that we run out of time here. Tuesday morning, or Monday morning, what happened? Well, all of us had lost everything. Our paymaster was very alert. He sent some divers out, welded a hook to the safe where it had millions of dollars in it, and they got a crane out, picked it up, set up an office ashore. Well, all the survivors could swear when we were last paid, and then we could be paid from that date. So that was high on the priority Monday morning to swear out a pay record. The only money Marina and I had is what was in her purse. And so the paymaster was a good friend of mine. I used to see him quite a bit. So I walked in to swear out my pay record. He had to set up a little temporary office. And he got up, and he came over, and he began to turn white, and he began to feel my arms and shoulders, He said, breathe hard, He said, well, Deacon, am I ever glad to see you? And I said, well, I'm glad to see you too, but we never had a ceremony like this before when we met. He said, do you know who walked out that door just before you came in? I said, no, I didn't notice. He said, it was a chaplain. He told me he had just buried you. Well, there's another man with my same last name that lost his life, and he's the one that buried. But I know what it's like, when somebody thinks they're seeing somebody back from the dead, by his reaction there.
Jim, just one more question. You then stayed on the West Virginia for a period of time. Just give us a little synopsis of the rest of your military history, because you stayed in through the war. Then at some point you picked up a commission. I don't know whether it was during the war. Just give us a little summary of your career.
Okay. I was signed up for a lot of money. And it was a secret that the West Virginia had been sunk. So I couldn't get released. I was bonded for it, and the bonding company wouldn't let me go. So I couldn't be transferred to a new ship until I accounted for all that money that was lost that morning. So I was part of the salvage crew. So we got the ship back up by the middle of June of 42. I got orders to the battleship South Dakota, where I would do the same thing I was trained to do on this ship. After I graduated from school, they needed instructors. So they asked me if I'd stay on, and I, not too reluctantly, stayed on in D.C. as an instructor. So I rode out the war from 42 to the end of the war in various gunnery schools teaching in Washington. Well, you can kind of pick your duty when you're that close to Washington. So my next assignment after that was working for the Brazilian government and the naval attaché in Rio de Janeiro. So that was my next assignment down there. Then my next tour of duty was a seaplane tender, and was stationed at San Juan, Puerto Rico on that. From that, I went to another seaplane ship for 3 years. We operated all over the Atlantic. From there, I went to the Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, New York, where I was an assistant professor of naval science for 2 years at the Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, New York. From there, I was ordered to go to Japan and take command of the USS Patapsco, and that was the next 3 years. Then I came back as a control officer at the U.S. Anti-Aircraft Training Center at Dam Neck, Virginia, and that's where I retired from there. I didn't show on the slide, but I do want to say this in conclusion, that West Virginia maintains a website, and it's got a lot of information. On that website is my detailed account, 2 chapters of my experience at Pearl Harbor. And you can see that at any time on the website, www, then all one word, USSWestVirginia.org. And so many of the things I've talked about are on there, plus a lot of other details. Well, real privilege to reminisce before you here today. Thank you.